Transference of guilt is an area of extreme importance in the psychological understanding of human behavior. But it is not only human beings who consciously or unconsciously get enmeshed in shrugging off their own guilt and passing it on to others. Nation states, powerful corporations also indulge in such behaviors. It then no longer becomes a case of I am miserable and why should not people around me feel the extent of my misery? Transference of guilt becomes a well thought out strategy, a cold and cynical exercise of unburdening oneself and passing on that burden to someone else at that person's cost. This is what precisely the West has been trying to do vis-à-vis India through the medium of the Ukraine war. This is what precisely powerful media corporates like the New York Times have been trying to do, painting India as an illiberal nation run by fanatics going all out to oppress its minorities. Let us examine these issues in more depth. But first, a big welcome to all viewers of the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. The CAA show is especially curated for thinking folks. To be a part of it, press the big red subscriber button on your screen. Subscription is, of course, completely free. One time-tested method of the West and international media houses to browbeat India is its persistently running commentary that India under the stewardship of Modi and chief ministers like Yogi are all out to crush the minorities and subjugate them. This is a continuous narrative both sides of the Atlantic, be it in the United States or Europe. The tone and tenor of this narrative can change depending on whether it's the Tories or Labour who are in power in Britain, or whether the Democrats or the Republicans call the shots in America. Human rights commissions in these countries serve as B team of the administration to bring pressure on countries like India to toe the line or else. I never quite understood the hypocrisy of these endeavors, especially when domestically these countries have so much to hide. But the problem is a little more serious than that. This hypocrisy is necessary to deflect attention from quite literally the monster in the basement of these countries. And that monster goes by the name of racism. Look at how Britain plans to handle the bands of illegal refugees streaming across the English Channel. It plans to ship or fly out all these refugees who to the last man, woman and child are all black and brown to the furthest black outpost in Africa called Rwanda. And unlike the title of the famous movie, there will be no Hotel Rwanda waiting for these refugees. There will be miserable camps and hovels waiting for them. Contrast this with the open, warm welcome the white Ukrainian refugees are receiving in Britain, Berlin, and many other parts of Europe and the US. Hearts and homes have been opened for the Ukrainian refugees. The contrast in the handling of the refugee situation is so blatant that it probably sets off a guilt reaction in the host countries. But living with guilt is not easy. Passing it on is. So, deflect the issue by raking India's so-called human rights minorities issue. Put the searchlight on India rather than illuminate your own dark corners. But this treatment is not only reserved for illegals. Look at the manner Britain's Labour Party and its media have gone after the very brown-looking Rishi Sunak and his wife. In a day, the very popular and efficient Rishi Sunak was brought down and forced in the doghouse for offences he never committed. Rishi Sunak broke no laws. His wife did not evade any taxes, and yet the entire establishment in Britain got after him and labelled him for the crime of being rich. They wanted to transfer their own guilt of being inherently racist to a trumped-up charge to transfer the guilt dogging them. Did the New York Times or the BBC or The Economist do a story on these lines? No, sir. That would be unthinkable. How could they? After all, as recently as 2 days back, the New York Times reinvented the entire COVID tragedy of the last 2 years by squarely blaming India for covering up COVID deaths in India and thereby bringing a bad name to the WHO by fudging data. This is the same NYT that went hysterical when Delta variant struck India as if it was the only country on the planet that was struggling with COVID. Could not it therefore be said that the NYT was in a sense managing the incompetence of successive US administrations who were managing COVID in the US and the abnormal number of deaths in the US and passing the guilt of those times and focusing on India on real or imagined aberration? The thing with passing the buck of guilt on others is that you need a human face to do the job. And in the spirit of malevolent genius, the West has found suitable brown faces, many of Indian origin, to do this job and name call India. To give just one example, Preeti Patel is the unpopular brown face to do the hatchet job on illegals through the Rwanda route. Let all the criticism of the policy in Britain be smeared on Preeti's face, as it were. After all, as the saying goes, it takes a thief to catch a thief, which when converted properly could in this case be, it takes a dark skin to bring down another dark skin. But really, it is the war in Ukraine that exposes the West's double-dealing ways. The West some years back was in a position to make Ukraine a NATO ally, but France and Germany opposed the move. And look what happened after that. No one wants to take ownership of the terrible guilt that seizes the West how badly they let down Ukraine. Best to pass on the guilt to countries like India for the sin of not condemning Russia and sticking to its policy of neutral strategic autonomy. There's one more thing we need to understand about the West. Whether the Westerner is a practicing Christian or not, the concept of good and evil, sin and redemption and guilt is part of practically every Westerner's DNA. We Asians, in comparison, are far more pragmatic and realistic about day-to-day life. The cultural concept of guilt by necessity also gives rise to the counterculture of hypocrisy of guilt. Those who take on guilt and suffering of others also find hypocritical ways of shrugging it off and transferring it to others. This is what is happening in the India versus West saga. And therefore, on this note, I come to the end of this episode of the CAA show. And I hope you really enjoyed this particular episode. If you like our show, do subscribe to us. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.